Hello. Okay. So meet my grandparents. From this photo, you likely think I'm about to talk about my grandfather. He was an architect who lost his eye in World War II. But in fact, this story is about my grandmother. She had molecular degeneration. And in the last 10 or 15 so years of her life, she slowly went blind. This made me hyper aware of all of the technology that both helped and hindered her. Fast forward a number of years, and I get some DNA testing done, and lo and behold, I too have that gene that is linked to molecular degeneration. So it's likely through my grandmother's that I witnessed a future where I have a decline in vision and a need for accessibility and technology. This is likely a story that many of you can relate to, either personally or through someone you know. In 2017, 5.6 million Canadians who did not identify as being visually impaired were estimated to have an eye disease that would result in sight loss. That's approximately 1 in 6 people. And a global study from 2020 predicted that the population with vision loss would increase by 55% by 2050. Hi, I'm Britta. I am a senior mobile developer at Shopify based out of Canada, where I work on the point-of-sale app for in-person selling. Discovering I would likely be blind in my future was a pivotal moment for me. And unlike my grandmother, I'm in a really unique position because I can influence and enhance the digital or the accessibility in the digital world before I lose my vision. And that's kind of why I'm here today. So thank you. So can I get a quick clap just a single clap, if you have coded a basic accessible component before? Awesome. So my talk is about kind of going beyond the basics, so it's nice to hear a good number of you have already coded a basic one. And I want to make sure that your apps are not just compliant, but inclusive. So I'll be sharing some insights and examples from the point-of-sale app to kind of help illustrate how we can do that. And let's get started, I guess. So I always like to start accessibility talks with a bit of terminology. So the first one should be more of a reminder than anything else, but accessibility is not a synonym for screen reader. I do talk about blindness quite a bit. Obviously, it's my bias. But when you're making an accessibility app or making an app accessible, there's a lot more things to think about. Number 2, blindness is not an all or nothing thing. In fact, 93% of people who are legally blind do have actually some vision. Number 3 is disability, or disabled, I should say. There's a big push kind of a couple of years ago where we were seeing a lot of people, a lot of companies going through their code base and cleaning up a lot of terminology, and one of those words that often got hit was disabled. So Apple's screen reader voiceover uses actually the word dimmed instead of disabled when Android has chosen to keep the term disabled. It isn't necessarily a negative term on its own. When using it in relationship with a person, I often hear this blanket statement to use people-first language. So that's a person with disabilities or a person with vision loss. But it is kind of important to also understand that there is something called identity-first language. And this is common in some communities, most famous are the autistic community. What it's really doing is kind of putting the emphasis on the community, the history, the culture of the people in that community. The only word I would stay away from is handicapped. That is considered a term that is both outdated and inappropriate now. The last term I like to touch on is introduce this idea of pre-disabled as a replacement for non-disabled. It's simply putting the attention on the fact that at some point in your life, you will experience an impairment, whether it's situational, temporary, permanent, due to an accident, or just from aging. Obviously, I relate to this a lot, but I would love to see more people using the term. So now that we're talking the same language, let's kind of do a bit of a quick recap to make sure we're on the same page for some of the code. So I'm going to use this button as our example and kind of talk through a bit of the accessibility props that you probably most likely see. When I get to each of the props as we go through it, if I can get that quick clap if you've used that prop before. So the accessible prop. Yes, OK. So this has a very misleading name, but it is to group those group components to make a single accessible component. Now we have accessible label. Awesome. So this is meant to be more for items that don't have text, but you can use it to override text as well. We now have role. These are preset. You can find them on the React Native docs, but it's questioning whether it's a header, whether it's a button, whether it's a slider. We also have state. I feel like we're getting slightly, maybe less people every time. So this is meant to be also, they're also preset, but it's meant to kind of give you the indication as if it's disabled, selected, checked, busy, or expanded. And now we have hint. Perfect. OK, so this is meant to be an additional guidance on the interaction of that element. They often are pre-populated, depending on the role. So you've probably heard double tap to activate for buttons, for example. And iOS users can turn these off. So can I get a quick clap if you've learned something new from what I just said? Ah, my talk's already working. It's great. So let's kind of dive past that now. And I'll kind of show you 4 different lessons that you can take home and hopefully make your apps more inclusive. So when Shopify moved over to React Native, I was coming in from iOS and then web before that. And so I was used to a certain level of accessibility built right into the code. And with clear guidelines. Although I don't really, I do see some of that improving on React Native. It doesn't quite give you quite the same amount out of the box, I feel. In comparison to web and React, I also see a lack of resources. And really, most of that is because the resources are really spread across. You really have more than one owner for those standards and guidelines, and sometimes those can be conflicting. You've got Apple, you've got Android, you've got React Native, and of course, a modified WCAG, or WCAG. Both have been acceptable ways of saying it, from what I understand, with those ratings of A, accessible, to AAA, the most accessible. I do tend to see most companies, and let me know if your company is different, but kind of aim for that AA standard. But the solution here really is to build in your accessible details right into your design system. The goal should be that your developers shouldn't have to do very much and should have to kind of go out of their way to make each of those components inaccessible if they're pulling it right from your design system. However, I do love it when you can also edit or update those accessible guidelines or the accessible details as well. So what does that look like? You can, one of the options is to actually create an optional accessible details prop. That is a type accessible props. And in your component, you can kind of decide which of those accessible props that you're going to allow override. This is just a couple of hints of ways that you can do it. Feel free to choose the approach that you do, or your pattern that you do in your company normally. But kind of a good rule of thumb I'd like to say is that the accessibility role isn't usually overridable. And I say this because if you have a button component in your design system and someone's trying to use it as something that is not a button, it's probably not the button component, and they should be doing another thing instead. But of course, that's a case-by-case decision and design system by design system choice. On point of sale, we've actually chosen to extend those accessibility props, so you can either do that, or you can just use the ones right out of the box. You can also make accessibility props non-optional. So in our design system, that button you saw earlier, we actually require the accessibility label. So we've baked that right into the higher level, and we make the easy option the accessible one. Lesson 2, let's talk about that favorite prop, accessible. Now, I hinted at this earlier, and it's actually the inspiration for the name of my talk. But the accessibility, or the accessible prop, sorry, isn't actually to make things accessible. It's to flatten components into a single accessible element. So I'm going to give you a quick demo, because it kind of helps prove my point a little bit more as to why those groupings are there. I will give you a quick warning. Text-to-speech is very quick. I did slow it down a little bit, but I wanted to give you Like I didn't want to misrepresent the experience of a screen reader user, so it will be quite quick. Oh, if there was sound. Uh-oh. Well, as you saw from things moving through, this is how you would get, like as you're kind of going through, you'll see that it's bouncing around quite a bit, and you're not actually getting things. Actually, could you hear the sound? No. Okay. We did like 3 checks on it, but that's okay. I'll keep rolling. So it bounces around a lot. Obviously, that's not a great experience for somebody who is using a screen reader. Everything is kind of segmented, and it takes a lot to kind of swipe through if you're doing the swipe through pattern. When you get the grouping, so I'm going to show you the grouping.
Number 173106.
We tend to group
no customer
it
US
by
$45.20.
rows.
Number 1645. No customer US $33.90. Number 1644. No customer US $45.20.
Perfect. I might actually just go back and have you guys hear it again.
Number 173110. $45 US and 20 cents. No customer. Paid. Fulfilled. Number 1633 US dollars and no customer. Paid. Fulfilled. Number 1645 US dollars. No customer. Number 173162. No customer US $45.20. Number 1645. No customer US $33.90. Number 1644. No customer US $45.20.
Yeah, so despite one not using the accessible prop, both are in theory accessible, but one is obviously a lot easier to navigate. At Shopify, and specifically on POS, we definitely really appreciate and are hyper aware of speed. I mean, the earlier talk was literally on performance. But so we really don't want that slow checkout process. So having it grouped like this is quite nice. So if I'm telling you this prop's so great, what do you mean that it can make things inaccessible? Well, this happens when you have multiple interactions in an element. So if you remember that accessible prop, we'll actually flatten that view into a single accessible element. If there's an interaction in that element, specifically on iOS, you'll lose that ability to tap that. So in point-of-sale app, we have many lists. We're known for flash list. And typically, those rows, each of those rows, have an on-press. And it's usually a single on-press. It's either to add an item to a cart or navigate to another page. But in products, you see that we've actually got this view details. So you're adding a product to the cart, or you can click view details on each of those rows. If we were to follow the pattern we usually do for a lot of more of our lists, you would lose that inability to tap the view details. So instead, we've actually opted to group the rows into 2 elements based on those 2 interactions and move that accessible prop around the left and right region. So the solution here really is to be strategic on your grouping, focus on components, and break it down depending on the interactions that those components have. Lesson 3, this is my favorite one. So after most people learn about accessibility and they start adding a lot of accessibility into their app, you often see that pendulum swing where you're kind of adding too much and you're overcompensating. So I have 3 different ways that this happens most often. And I do want to call out that this is usually happening because people are trying to be helpful and they really have good intentions. And for the most part, these are accessible on screen readers. I will show you later. But they obviously could be a lot better. The first and biggest offender is the overuse of alt text. So alt text being alternative text, which is that common name for a accessible label for images. So here's an example.
Photograph of Davy Arts Collective Silver Branch Stud Earrings on white background, Silver Branch Stud Earrings, button. Photograph of Davy Arts Collective Silver Branch Cuff on white background, Silver Branch Cuff Free Variants, button. Photograph of Davy Arts Collective Oval Eye Chain Bracelet on white background, Oval Eye Chain Bracelet, button. Photograph of Davy Arts Collective Silver Starburst Earrings on white background, Silver Starburst Earrings, button.
Again, it's true that this is accessible, but there is a lot of unnecessary information in there, and it gets really in the way of achieving the main task. Kind of reminds me of those 90s websites when you're having a hard time kind of focusing on what really matters on the page, and you kind of get caught digging through all those unnecessary details. So when do you use alt text? There's a couple kind of questions you can ask yourself. Does the image include text? Does it convey a content, like a graph? Is it a link or a button and has no other text component? Would someone be at a disadvantage if they couldn't see the image? If you've answered no to all of these questions, it is likely that your text, or that your image is decorative and does not need a label. The next way I see people adding too much context is by focusing more on the details rather than the big picture. So here's an example of a list row for an order. And you might think, OK, I want to call out, like, this is order number 1,770, da-da-da-da-da. But now let's look at that component on the screen. You have not one, not two, oh, that was the wrong one. It should have been on all orders. And but three different times that we've used the word order. So I'm pretty sure your users are going to know they're on the order screen. We don't also need to be adding it to every single row. Again, this is just a small thing that will actually add up in terms of making the user go a little bit slower. The last example of too much context is using hints instead of labels. So although this extra content might seem really great for a screen user the first couple times they use your app, when they start to become more frequent users, it will slow them down, but also it might block other assistive technologies. So who here knows, single clap if you know what voice control is? Great. So it is Apple's assistive technology that lets you use your voice to actually control the interactions on your screen. Who here has an app that they have tested with voice control? OK, 1, 2. I think there was a couple. You'll see in this video that I try to guess at what some of the buttons names are when I trial out voice control. I do have some successes, but I also have some failures. So let's hope that my sound works.
Press 1.
Correct.
Repeat 3 times.
It's a lot slower than screen reader use.
Press submit. Oh, perfect, that worked. OK. Now, if I wanted to hit search, I'm going to say maybe press search. OK, nothing happened. Show names. Press double tap to search for products, orders, and. OK. Press double tap to search for products, orders, and. Oh, there we go.
So I tried submit worked fine, but when I tried search on the magnifying glass, which I assumed that would be, it didn't work. And so when I asked to show names to see what that label was and what I needed to call out, I realized that that label really looked like a hint more than a label. And it took me a couple times to actually say what I needed to say to get through. It's something to note is that voice control is using those same accessible labels as you would get for a screen reader. So changing our button's accessible label to just search not only made the voice control users a lot faster, but it also sped up screen reader users as well. So it's really just a win-win. So the solution here is to keep content short, put the need-to-know information in the labels, and any extras should go in hints. My last lesson is about hierarchy and focus management. And this is kind of a unique topic for mobile. And I'm kind of showing you another example because it hits home a little bit more.
Customers, tab, 4 of 5, button, so back. Products, tab, 3 of 5, button, back. Orders, tab, 2 of 5, button, back. Products, tab, 3 of 5, button, back.
So this, again, it's putting us up at that top. You're hearing back as the first element. For anyone who's cited, the first thing they see is where they are. They see the fact that they're on that order number, 61644, or that they're on customer B Evans. That is what we're telling our cited users to see because that is the biggest component. But we're not giving that information to our screen reader users. Instead, they're hearing back every time. So there is a few different ways that you can kind of help with this. One way is you can just design your apps so that the focus is on that top corner. So typically, I will say the way that what it navigates to first is usually through the accessibility tree. So depending on how you're actually coding things up, you'll see that your likely to hit that first top left corner node, as long as it's accessible. So you can just put things there, and that will be the first thing that it'll see, so the top leftmost corner. You can, in theory, re-architect your code so that it is not reaching that, but it's reaching wherever you need. But honestly, my recommendation is probably to do a bit of a redirect instead. So if you remember before, I showed you the accessibility details for point of sale. And I was mainly showing you this because we do extend them with a autofocus. And that's because our header component uses the autofocus. It was inspired by Shopify's COVID alert app. I will have a resource guide at the end, by the way, with a link to that repo as well. So if you are interested in pulling this code and not just getting the meat of it, this would be it. But yes, basically it's got a focus on element that automatically focuses on the node you want as long as it meets the conditions, including the screen reader on. So the solution here is either design for the focus or redirect the focus. So these are just really a few examples, but the main theme for all of them is that we're trying to make apps accessible to use, and not just accessible, but make them pleasant regardless of if you have a disability or if you are pre-disabled. Accessibility isn't a synonym to inclusive either. I encourage you all to try using a screen reader for a day or voice control to kind of understand that space better if you haven't already. But here's that guide I promised. I've included book recommendation, a link to a bunch of the resources I've mentioned. I've even got a 5-minute talk on there for like how to use the screen reader already in your pocket. So if you're not familiar with voice control, not familiar with VoiceOver or TalkBack, I would really recommend this. I can put something up for voice control if people are interested in as well. But yeah, I look forward to seeing and exploring more of your accessible apps. So thank you.